Who knows? I could have like a six-pack in my 60s. I do not currently, but I could in my 60s. And yeah, I could be like the hot, non-binary, cool, advice-giving hippie person that you could surf around with and also has a six-pack. And maybe some tattoos. Maybe. I'll think about it. Welcome to the Coffeeshop AU. I'm Jay, your host. I'm trans, non-binary, neurodivergent, and I am currently based in Seoul, Korea. My pronouns are they, them, and today I'm here by myself to talk about yours truly. This is the last episode of the season, and so far I've interviewed my friends who come from different walks of life and have different intersecting identities in terms of their queerness, ethnicities, and nationalities. And I thought, to wrap it all up, I'd interview myself, so you can get to know a little bit about me, what experiences I've had in my life, and why I decided to make the show. I have a glass of iced Americano next to me, and I'm sitting in my closet room / storage / guest room of the apartment I live in. And I thought a lot about where I would start my own story of realizing my queerness, my trans journey, and my third culture background. In my mind, it's still jumbled up. It's just my life, so it was hard for me to think of questions for myself. But I have decided to start by telling you a little bit about my accent. My current accent when I speak English, I guess. Because believe it or not, this is my secondary English accent. Yeah, let me explain. So I was born in Korea, and I grew up in Korea, in a Korean family until I was 12 years old. I was pretty neurodivergent as a kid. I don't think that really changed. My parents saw that I was a little bit different, a little sensitive, pretty creative, and kind of struggled with conventional systems of education. And they thought, okay, Jay's never going to survive the Korean educational system, which can be quite strict and rigid and very, very demanding. So let's move them to a different country where there's a less demanding educational system and also where they'll get to learn English, because that was and remains a pretty important skill set to have in Korea. I don't really know what they thought about my brother, who also moved with us, but it's interesting how my brother actually ended up settling in the UK. You know, he has his own family now, and he really is doing very well in London, whereas turns out, England was not a good fit for me. I ended up coming back to Korea in my mid-20s. And when I eventually came back to Korea, my accent was pretty English sounding. And every single new person that I would meet here who also spoke English would ask me where I was from. And sometimes, why is your English so good? And I found myself having to explain that I had lived in England for a long time. And then they would go, oh, well, I love your accent. Because a lot of people who were asking me these questions were from somewhere in North America. And then they would follow that comment up with, what was it like to live in England? And that's a very normal question to ask, but it was kind of inconvenient for me. Because I was meeting a lot of new people, which meant I was having this conversation over and over and over again on a pretty much daily basis at that point, and B, I did not think of my accent as an accent. In my mind, they were the ones with an accent. So it was kind of strange for me to hear them saying, like, I love your accent. Like, what do I say? Like, you too, I love your accent too. Clearly, they did not think that they had an accent. I just didn't know what to say to that. And then C, in trying to answer their question, what was it like to live there? I found myself having to think back to my experiences in England, which were, I began to realize, not great. It did not feel good to think back on my time in England. And I felt like if I was too honest, which at that point, like, I hadn't completely mastered, like, the social graces of small talk, and I would sometimes get a little bit too honest and then just, like, see the smile fade gradually from their faces. And I felt like I was kind of letting them down somehow, because so many people I spoke to had fantasies about England. And while I think that's totally understandable. Being asked the same question over and over again just kind of ended up reminding me of the things that I didn't quite care to relive. It was almost like a weird flashback too, because I was always getting asked where I was from when I was living in England, and I was already tired of that. So at a certain point, I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to discuss my time in England with basically total strangers anymore. And I didn't really want to talk about my past. I didn't even want to mention that I used to live in England in this like very casual chit-chatty way. And I didn't really want to think about, at that point, what I was coming to understand as a pretty sad and dark time in my life. So I started to learn the accent of my new friends who were also from North America. I've always been pretty quick to pick up languages here and there, and like, this is an interesting fact about me. I have played the piano since I was 5, so like I have a pretty good ear. I'm quite good at emulating sounds and accents. So I started copying my friends' accents, and over time I succeeded in starting to sound less and less English and more North American. Of course, I'm aware that there are different accents in North America, just like there are different accents in the UK and Korea. And I think I've spent most of my time with people from the Midwest. But interestingly, once I went to a social gathering where there were predominantly people from North America who were meeting me for the first time, and someone asked me if I was from the West Coast. And that took me by surprise because I have never been to the West Coast in the States ever. And so I told them no, and why did they think so? And they said that I had the vibe. And I was like, what kind of vibe? And they were like, sort of like laid back, kind of easygoing and friendly. And I was like, oh, cool. I took it as a compliment. It did not make me feel bad. And it actually kind of tickled me because this accent that I'm speaking with now, it's kind of artificial in the sense that I decided that I wanted to speak like this, and I chose to speak in this way rather than just like soaking up by proxy. Like, I was also spending a lot of time with people from the States, and to some extent I think I did pick it up by just hanging out with them, but mostly it was my decision to cover up my English accent with this new accent, and apparently it worked. So I was kind of glad about that. It's definitely more common to hear North American accents here in Korea. And after I started speaking in this more common way, nobody ever asked me where I was from again. The West Coast question was kind of an exception, and it also came with the assumption that I was in some way from the States. So I achieved what I set out to do. Very happy, except, sometimes my friends who have known me for decades will meet me and they'll hear me speak English and they'll be like, what happened to your accent? And then I tell them the explanation I've given you now. And they look mildly disappointed. And I'm like, oh no. The inner people pleaser in me is like, I'm letting them down again. But if I think back to the reasoning of why I covered up my accent is because I think I felt really uncomfortable being singled out. I was back in this country where, after having lived so long in a country where I was an ethnic minority and everybody could tell just by looking at me, oh, you're East Asian, and we're not. Finally, I come back to this country where most people look like me. And when I spoke in Korean, which I kept speaking with my family after I moved to the UK, so my Korean is fluent, nobody would even think to ask me if I was from somewhere else, at least when we first meet and before we get into conversations about, where did you grow up or whatever. But when I spoke in English, when I first arrived, I sounded different from everybody else around me. I heard it every time I would speak with my friends, me sounding so different from the majority of the people that I was spending a lot of time with, and it made me uncomfortable. Like, nobody was telling me that I sounded weird. In fact, a lot of people complimented me on my accent. A lot of people would just go like, oh my gosh, I love English accents. Oh my gosh, this is so cool. And that's how I found out, actually, that's kind of a thing, especially in the States, I feel like. Quote unquote, the British accent's considered to be quite attractive. And I actually think that by British accent, they mean like the English accent and particular types of English accents, because there are so many different types of English accents. But that aside, I just think it's a little jarring for somebody to say I love that accent. I've heard people say that about different types of accents, and I still think it's just a little bit weird. I'm not saying that people are weird for finding certain accents attractive or liking the way someone sounds. It's just that I don't hear it. I actually sometimes have a hard time hearing accents. It's been changing with time and experience, but for most of my life, whether I was speaking in Korean or English, I will register that someone sounds different from me, but I don't actually think to myself they're speaking in this and this accent. And I think that's because, like, to me, how they sound isn't as important as what they're saying to me, like, for me to comprehend what they're saying. It's not really the accent, it's just like how they put things. And I think living in London, where I was exposed to a lot of different accents, I think on some level my brain just got used to hearing different accents, and it sort of filters accents out automatically to just make communication more efficient in a way. Even now, especially English accents, I tend not to really even register it because for so long that was my normal. So when someone is speaking with an English accent, I don't even really tend to think like, wow, they're speaking with an English accent. I won't even realize that they're speaking with an English accent until somebody else points out this person has an English accent. But if someone is speaking with a Scottish accent, for example, I'll think, oh, that person is speaking with a different accent. Actually, I really like Scottish accents, and I like American accents and Australian accents and all sorts of different accents. In Korean, I really, really like the Busan accent. So yeah, forget what I said earlier. I do like different accents. I just don't really have like a favorite, is what I'm trying to say. It's really hard to record an episode with nobody to talk to. I wrote out a script, but it's kind of all over the place. But this is how my brain works, even with ADHD medication, which I got diagnosed with recently. But it's only been like a week, and I'm on the lowest dose. So we'll see how the rest of this episode goes. I'm gonna try my best to keep it coherent. Bear with me. I guess my thing with when people would say to me, oh, I love British accents, I think the discomfort I was feeling was like feeling somewhat exotified in a place that I really didn't want to be seen as exotic. At that point, I really, really just wanted to blend in and not feel different. That's a really big thing for me. I think the more I interact with people, the more conversations I have with people, I realize just how much of a thing it is for me. Not wanting to feel different, not wanting to feel especially different from the people that are close to me. And I think a lot of that does come from being neurodivergent. Divergent people are often told and made to feel like there's something wrong with us because the way we think or perceive things and process things are kind of different. But also, growing up in England did a number on me, definitely. The day I arrived in England, I understood that the way people are looking at me and my family was completely different from how people in Korea looked at us. And that kind of feeling of being singled out and being treated differently, and that kind of weird distance or sometimes suspicion, even hostility in how I saw other people perceiving me, it made me extremely aware of the fact that I looked different from the people around me. And of course, I didn't know it then, but I also was struggling with some gender dysphoria as I was hitting puberty, and again, like neurodivergence. Like, I am super sensitive to how people react to me, and because I've had to deal with a lot of rejection in my life, I didn't have like the most peaceful upbringing. That I've had a lot of violent experiences in my childhood, and so I am just like in general pretty sensitive to conflict or any kind of whatever my system, my brain like perceives as a threat. And so it was not great to grow up in an environment that was constantly telling me that I was different. And I also experienced little things that I think we would nowadays call microaggressions, but also kind of like more direct instances of racism and discrimination, like people making like vaguely Chinese sounding noises when I passed, or like pulling on the corners of their eyes in class, or once having raw eggs thrown at my feet from a passing car as I was jogging with my dad in the town that I was living in at the time. And these are just some of the examples of what I experienced as somebody who looked different in the UK. And like there were also expectations and biases toward me as like a femme presenting East Asian person. I think that really also like really messed with my own self-perception and like my relationship to the world around me, because what other people seem to expect of me, like my behavior, the way I spoke, or like the kinds of things I would talk about, or how I just presented myself with clothing and just mannerisms, I felt like they were just so different from who I actually was on the inside. And I think all these experiences, they built up. And those experiences really impacted me to not want to stand out. Those experiences really taught me that standing out and looking different or acting different, sounding different, not that I really sounded different. I think I sounded pretty English by the time that I'd lived there for a few years, but no matter how well I spoke the language, I understood also that nobody there, especially white English people who were meeting me for the first time or even over a long period of time, they would never see me as being similar to them. They would always treat me, and this was my experience, they would always treat me as a foreigner, as a stranger to their land. And, you know, it's not just that I felt like a stranger and an alien the entire time I was living there, but also I felt unsafe because of the way I looked, because I had like physical assaults and verbal assaults that happened to me over the course of my time living in England. Being different for these reasons, to me, in my mind, that translates to being unsafe. So I really don't like to be more different than I need to be than the people around me, which is obviously kind of hard when you're trans and neurodivergent, because like I am different. But at that point, I hadn't met too many people who were also different and also kind of struggling with similar things that I was struggling with. That would come way later when I came back to Korea. I think that's another reason why I wanted to cover up my accent. Everybody around me was speaking in a North American accent. I didn't want to stand out and be the one person in the group, like identifiable person who spoke differently. And talking about this is kind of difficult for me. Like, I wrote a lot of stuff down, but now I'm realizing that I can't read everything out loud because it's pretty triggering. I still feel a lot of extreme sadness and extreme rage when I think about some of the direct and indirect acts of discrimination that I was on the receiving end of, and especially because I was so young and because I couldn't really defend myself. Like, I didn't have the tools or like the concepts or the language to even defend myself with. And a lot of the times when something would happen, I would just be like frozen because I was so shocked. Because even though I knew that I didn't feel welcome at any point in living in England, I always felt like I had to justify my reasoning for being there and occupying the spaces that my white presenting friends were occupying without even questioning it. So I was always sort of on the lookout for somebody to say like, hey, you don't belong here. You should make yourself even smaller than you already are. But that's not to say I was always expecting something really bad to happen to me. So whenever they would happen, I would just be like, what do I do here? Like, I don't know what to do. And I think in some ways I kind of carried around that guilt of, oh, I failed to protect myself. I failed to fight back. When actually it just shouldn't have happened to anybody. And there's not a very good way of defending yourself when somebody's just like, yeah, throwing eggs at you from a passing car. Like, what do you do? So I think looking different, standing out as different, being identified as being very different from the people around me is always kind of a very scary thing for me, and it's a very sad thing for me. So I tried really hard to fit in once I moved back to Korea by like changing my accent and hoping that nobody's gonna like ask me any more questions about like where I was from or whatever, because I don't have a lot of happy memories of living in England. I met some really good friends there, but for whatever reason, even though London is one of the more queer-friendly places that you could find, and I had friends in university who all turned out later to be queer, we never really talked that much about queerness. At the time, we were all struggling, like questioning different things. We would talk about a lot of different things. I studied filmmaking, so we talked about a lot of movies, we talked about a lot of books, and we talked about life, and we did a lot of stuff together. I really enjoyed having that group of friends in university, but we were just asking questions about life, about ourselves. You know, that wasn't just like restricted to like our queer identities or orientations. And like a lot of my friends were not super interested in dating in the traditional sense. I think we're all quite neurodivergent, to be honest, and I'm pretty sure there were other asexual, aromantic people in my friend group. We just never really talked about it because, again, a lot of us just didn't know the language, we didn't know the concepts, and we were just like babies who were kind of blubbering around, and we're like, oh, what's this, what's that, what are you, like, what am I, like, we don't know, let's find out. So we just never like talked about it. I never really had a queer community of friends the way that I do now. And this is kind of interesting to me. I remember that we did talk a little bit about being queer or queer identities and like sort of talking about attractions to what we thought was like same gender attraction at the time. And I don't remember anybody being homophobic, like never in my friend group. That was never a thing. And we had like other friends who were like openly queer, but it was just never an issue. We didn't even talk about it. So I think that's kind of different than meeting somebody with the understanding that they are queer. They're openly queer and you're also openly queer. That creates a different kind of environment to have different sorts of conversations in. So it always is interesting to me that I lived in London for over 4 years right before I left to come back to Korea. And it was just never like, I went to Pride once and it was great. This woman, this like femme person with like glitter on their face, I was like taking pictures and this woman came up to me and she just like smiled at me and she gave me a little kiss on the cheek and then she was just like on her merry way, and it was a really lovely thing to experience. I knew by then that I was queer, for sure, but even then, I didn't feel like I really blended in with the rest of the people. I think just culturally, England is just not a good fit for me, especially to like explore myself, because I was really worried about how I presented ethnically and how that meant I had to modify my behavior. I had to watch what I said. I had to watch what I did, how I acted, because yeah, people had these really specific expectations of me, and if I didn't meet that, some people were just surprised, some people were like turned off and wouldn't like speak to me any further, and some people were just kind of like outright very angered that I wasn't acting in the way that they expected me to as like this Asian girl in their mind. The way I came to discover my pansexuality and accept it was actually kind of funny. I just graduated university and I was cleaning my bathroom and I had this YouTube video on while I was cleaning on my little iPhone 5, and there was this kind of like celebrity news coming out of it, and it said Miley Cyrus had just come out as pansexual, and I'm like, what's pansexual? So I looked it up, and when I read the description for pansexuality, I was like, oh, that's me. It didn't even take me a minute. I read the description and I was like, that's me. Okay, great. I now have a word for it. Awesome. And I didn't think twice about it. And I do think that that probably had something to do with living in London for a long time and having friends who were bi. I actually had a lot of friends who were bi in university, and I knew people who were gay and lesbian. And to me, that was just such a non-issue that I kind of like glossed over it. I remember maybe talking to one or two friends after and saying like, hey, there's a word for what I am. And it apparently means that you don't care what gender the person you like identifies as. You're just attracted to the person. And then all the people that I've told that to in my memory, like there aren't like exact memories that stand out, because again, it was such a non-issue for everybody I spoke to that they were just like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And that was that. Even though I had crushes on masc-presenting people and femme-presenting people at that point, the word bisexuality just never resonated with me. But when I saw the word pansexuality, I was like, this is me. No, I know for sure this is exactly the type of attraction that I experience to people. And so I was pretty like happy to have found that word. There was no conflict, there was no baggage, there was no further explanation needed for myself or for anybody else in my life. Now, when it comes to my trans identity, the story is a little bit different. If you've listened to Sheri's episode and or Hyeyoung's episode, you'll know that they are two of the first people I met when I came back to Korea, and I was just socializing to make more friends, and they happened to be two of the first people I met, and they were also queer. They also spoke both Korean and English. They also happened to have a large group of queer community around them, which then they introduced me to, and I fell into this group of really cool queer people who were a mix of Korean and English speaking people. In that group was this person who was non-binary, and Again, I had heard of the word non-binary, but whenever I thought about anything gender related and any kind of like alternative gender identities to the one that I was assigned at birth, which was like a girl, and then later on a woman, she, her, I was overcome with a sense of panic. I felt scared, and I felt super anxious to even start thinking about gender stuff, and I didn't know why at the time. And now I know that I was in denial. So when I met my first openly non-binary person in real life, because they're already part of this community that I also became a part of, I got to like interact with them on a daily basis. I got to see them interacting with other people in the group and how they were treated by other people in the group. And what I saw was so ordinary. Pretty normal. Like nobody was treating this person any different just because they were non-binary, and this person just seemed to take everything in stride. Like, yeah, I'm non-binary. This is how I present. What are you gonna do about it? Like, this is who I am. And I was like, that is awesome. And I think in a way, watching that interaction and that exchange and that dynamic within the community that I really liked being a part of almost gave me a sense of safety to then start looking at my own gender identity in a way that I just never felt safe enough to do before. So little bit by bit, it was a very gradual process. When I got to know the non-binary friend a little better, I asked them if it would be okay for me to ask some questions about their gender, and they said sure. And I asked, what does that mean to you? What does genderqueer mean? Like, how do you use that language? What does that label mean to you? And so like they told me, and I was like, okay. And I sat on it and I thought about it, and like I really took my time probably over the course of like 2 years or something, and kept thinking, could I also be non-binary? Because what they're describing, this feeling of not really feeling like a man or a woman, I've always felt that way ever since I could remember. When I would go to anywhere as a child with my mother, people would refer to me as her daughter. And they would say, oh, you've got such a cute daughter. She's so pretty, like blah, blah, blah. And I always felt like, who are they talking about? Like, I knew they were referring to me, but I thought that they were mistaken, that there was some kind of mistake, because I did not feel like a girl. And also, like, I didn't feel like a boy. My mom always likes to say, when you were little, you really liked to play with dolls. And I'm like, yeah, because dolls were the only toys you bought for me. What she doesn't remember is that I also liked to play with cars and robots that were supposedly toys for my brother. And he liked to play with my dolls too. So it's funny what people choose to remember because of the narrative that society tells us is like the correct thing. I think it's hard to perhaps retain memories outside of that boundary that you're given. So regardless of what my mom remembers, I know that I always felt like people were not seeing me clearly when they would refer to me as a girl. The earliest memory I have of this is like when I was like 4 or something, I think around there. And then as I hit puberty after moving to the UK, I remembered this feeling just getting even stronger. I was so uncomfortable in my skin all the time, and a lot of teenagers do. When you're a teenager, you are kind of at an awkward phase in your life physically and emotionally. A lot of changes are happening. Can be really overwhelming. But this feeling didn't disappear with age. It lasted well into my 20s. And actually, like when I was 23, I remember this age really exactly because I wrote it down in my diary. I was alone in my house, and I had just come out of the bathroom again. I think I have a lot of revelations in and around bathrooms. I don't know why, but I had just like come out of the bathroom, and I was walking toward my desk, and I saw myself in the mirror, and I just stopped in my tracks. It's kind of like a lightning hit me in that moment, and I don't know to this day why in that moment, what brought that about. I really don't know, but I looked at my reflection in the mirror and I thought to myself, that person should be in a masculine body. That's the wrong body for this person. It was not even a thought. It was a thought and like a physical sensation, like a physical knowing, a very clear revelation of my own identity, and it freaked me out so much that the next thought I had was, but I can't. There's no way. I was 23, and at the time, there was just not a lot of conversation going on about medical transitioning procedures for trans people. And even in that moment, I didn't think that, oh, I'm a man. Like, that was not the feeling. It was just looking at my body and feeling like whatever I am on the inside, the outside is wrong. It's the wrong look for who I am. And as soon as I thought it, I kind of shut it down. But I still remember the age that I was, the clothes that I was wearing, the lighting in the room, and the absolute overwhelming, crystal clear knowing, and also the terror that I felt in that moment. When I was in 6th grade, there's a musician that made her debut in Korea, and her name is Harisu, and she was the first trans woman that I had ever seen. Probably the first trans person that I'd ever seen, and she was on TV, and she was beautiful, and she was really talented. And I remember watching her on stage and just going like, wow, she's really awesome. And then I heard the adults around me going like, oh, she's transgender, and all the news articles and even on the music shows she would be on, they would mention the fact that she's a trans woman. And I was just confused by that. I was like, what does that mean? And like, how is she different from any other femme presenting singers? Like, to me, she doesn't seem any different. Why is it such a big deal? But the way that people around me were talking about her and her being transgender was so seedy, like so hush hush, so like it's something that is a scandal. So even though I didn't really understand what that meant, I think I asked my aunt one time what transgender is, and she kind of told me, but I think she probably put it in a pretty crude way because whatever I heard, I didn't really like what I heard, and I don't really remember it very clearly. But I don't think that any of us at that time had a very good understanding of gender and physiology and the medical, like bottom surgery, top surgery. Like, it was all in like very crude language, and I read it in my aunt's demeanor that she didn't really want to talk about it. She was embarrassed about it. She wanted to get the conversation over and done with. So I grew up with this understanding that being transgender is kind of like a shameful thing or something that makes other people super uncomfortable. And of course, I was exposed to other popular media that would portray trans people as something either to be laughed at, to be made fun of, or somebody who was like really wrong and perverted and weird, and like somebody who deserved violence and meanness and bullying. And growing up in the UK, I already felt very vulnerable as an ethnic minority, that I didn't want any extra thing about me to give other people any more excuse to see me as even more of a minority, which is to say, to see me as even more powerless. So I think that probably really like fed into my fear. And so even though I have a really vivid memory of having that moment, very, very clear moment of knowing that in essence I was trans, I didn't do anything, I didn't look up any information, I stayed away from things that had to do with being trans until I met that non-binary friend in Korea. I was like 27 or 28 when I actually came to embrace the fact that I was non-binary. And it took me some more years to accept the fact that I needed medical transitioning, even though it was something that scared me for the same reasons that I just mentioned. Like, I didn't want people thinking that I was different, looking at me and going, what are you? As much as I like talk about how important it is to look outside of the box, step out of the box with my guests on the show, I'm still scared to step out of the box because there are no safety nets. And if you step out of the box and something bad happens to you, a lot of the times what people will tell you is maybe you're asking for it just a little bit. So I didn't want to put myself in that vulnerable position. And even though I had really great people in the queer community that I was a part of at the time, back then we were still kind of ignorant about non-binary identities, trans identities. And when I cautiously brought up my potential plans to start my medical transitioning at some point in the future, almost every single person I spoke to in the queer community said something or other that really made me feel like I shouldn't go through with it. And some people since then have apologized to me for saying those things. We all can see better now. At the time, I was also quite not confused about the fact that I was non-binary, but very hesitant about the fact that I would need medical assistance to actually get to a place where I would feel less dysphoria and just less pressure about my own gender identity. And I recognized that, and I really appreciated their apology, especially because I saw some of them really put in the work to change since that point. And at that time, I was also looking up online resources and stories of people who were either binary trans people or like non-binary trans people. And there's something that I remember from a video I watched at the time, which was by Jackson Bird, who is a writer and a speaker and a performer and a obviously YouTube content creator. If you don't know him, go check out his channel. It's great. And there's something he said in one of his videos speaking on his transitioning experience as a trans guy. He said it often gets worse before it gets better. And he was talking specifically about that point in your life where you realize that you're trans and you're like trying to come to grips with it and trying to like just process this truth. I really held on to those words because this was coming from somebody who had gone through the experience, gone through the process before me, and it's kind of all I had. Nobody around me in my personal life, even the non-binary friend, nobody had gone through a medical transitioning process. And there was nobody who could really give me like a lived experience account of what it was like for them, except for people I could find online. And I think that was actually my first experience of understanding the power of telling your story in the way that you want to tell it, that is still truthful, but in a way that you want people to know it, because somewhere in this world, there is somebody who really needs to hear it, and it can make a lot of difference for them. So I guess, I don't know if Jackson Bird will ever hear this episode, but if you are, then thank you very much for those lovely kind words that you said in your video, and videos since then too. I was thinking about top surgery for like 2 years. And then I started saving up for top surgery, which also took 2 years. And then I went in for consultation once I had enough money saved up. But then some other stuff happened aside from the pandemic. And it took me another 2 years to go in for my second consultation and actually book the date for the surgery, which is this coming May. So all in all, it took me like 6 years to really make the decision to get it. And in the meantime, a couple of things happened. This is gonna sound pretty heavy, and if you don't really want to hear about people passing, funerals, death, then feel free to skip this part. Look to the episode description to see when the next segment starts. Around the same time the pandemic started, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. It was kind of a shock to all of us. And then my grandmother passed. And I attended my first funeral of somebody who was close to me. And then my uncle passed, and seeing someone that I really love go through all the operations and following treatments and being in a lot of pain and really getting to have serious, in-depth, raw conversations about the looming high likelihood of their death, and then attending funerals of family members who had always been around since I was born shifted a lot of things for me. Especially my grandmother's death and going to her funeral changed my outlook on things in a lot of ways. She was actually the first person to see me for the person that I was inside. Sometime before she passed, when she was still healthy. She had been unwell for a while before she passed, but a couple of years before that, I had gone to visit her. And at that time, I had my entire head shaved. And every person that saw my haircut for the first time was kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? And she was the first person to say to me, hey, it looks kind of good on you. You look handsome. And I was like, thank you. That means a lot. And she was like, yeah, it must be really easy to shampoo and dry and no drying time. And I was like, yeah, that's right. At that time, I hadn't told her anything about my gender identity or my orientation. And she's somebody who is a Korean woman of her time, in the sense that whenever she would see me or any of my other single cousins, she would ask when we would get married. And that time she also asked me, like, Jay, when are you going to get married? And I was like, well, I don't know if I want to get married. I gotta meet somebody first to get married. And yeah, I don't know when that will be or if I will meet anybody. And she just kind of like sat on it for a little bit, and then she went, yeah, you know what? I don't think you need to get married. I think you could meet a nice girl and just live with her. You could live with your friend, and you could just like share the chores and just live like good friends. And then she said she could be like your wife. And I was kind of shocked to hear her say that because we'd never ever discussed anything queer ever. But in that moment, somehow, intuitively, I felt like she got it. And that always really stuck with me. And during her funeral, in Korea, we usually hold funerals for 3 days. I got to speak to a lot of my extended family members. And, I accidentally sort of came out to an aunt about my being non-binary and about being pansexual. And I don't know if it was because we're at a funeral or not, but it just didn't really become an issue. Even though, like, both sides of my family are all Christians, and I don't know, it could have been an issue, but it wasn't. And the attire that I wore for the funeral, there's a specific attire that's required for funerals, especially the host family. And I wore a suit that is traditionally for men. I didn't want to wear a dress. I didn't want to feel uncomfortable or dysphoric at my grandmother's funeral. I didn't want that feeling of like I'm pretending here and I can't really connect to what's really happening here. And the entire time during the funeral, I felt like this is right. Like, I feel like I was honoring my grandmother in a way because she did see me. She did see me, then like she understood a part of me that I didn't really put into words, but I didn't have to. And I also got to have a lot of conversations with my dad during the funeral. He was a little too unwell to attend, but he was staying nearby. And so every evening I would go, and before everybody went to bed, I would just talk to him about how the funeral was and just kind of have all these kinds of conversations that centered around the limitations of the time that we have together on Earth, which was obviously a little bit more real to us. It felt closer because of his condition. But yeah, that whole experience of witnessing the actual aftermath of somebody's passing and sitting with the grief and sharing the grief with other people that I loved also, I think it gave me a chance to really, really think deeply about what mattered to me. And I was able to see, because like the scales of things change when you are close to death, I suppose, or when you're kind of in the middle of grief. I was able to sort of zoom out and see how much I had been letting fear hold me back from the things that actually really did matter to me. And these things were not all related to my gender identity or medical transitioning, but in terms of medical transitioning, even though I had begun saving up for my top surgery and in a place to like seriously consider my medically transitioning, the fact that I couldn't undo some of the changes that would come with those procedures was still holding me back a little bit. It was still kind of scary, and it made me hesitate and go, I will save up for these procedures, but I don't know 100% for sure if I'm going to go through with it or when I will go through with it. And getting to experience the physical finality of death in a way helped me let go of a lot of the weight that I've been carrying about what if the results aren't as I hoped? What if some of the treatments don't go in a way that I really want it to go? And what if I have to live with that for the rest of my life? And all these what ifs, they sort of fell away in the months following because I was grieving, and also I saw that, time is limited for all of us, and we can only do what we think is best in the time that's given to us. So a few months after the funeral, I decided to move back home. I had been living on my own, but I think losing my family members made me realize that one of the things that is really important to me is to spend time with my family in the time that we do have together. So I decided to move back home and decided to start my medical transitioning process. And my parents, they're not against it. So they're not supportive, but they're not against it. And they have a lot of anxieties about side effects, and I always make sure to do research and update them on whatever I found. And so far, there's not like too much to worry about. And I have a really good doctor now. I've mentioned in some of the previous episodes, I have found a really great clinic where the doctor really cares about her patient's well-being, and I can ask any questions I want, I can share any concerns I want with her, and she will take them really seriously, and she'll work with me, and she'll listen to me. So I keep reminding my parents that I have people who are helping me with this in this process, and I'm not alone. And I think even though this process of figuring out who I am has been such a long journey, honestly, filled with a lot of ups and downs and twists and turns, what I have been able to discover is that I am capable of sitting with uncertainty and finding the answers that might not be right for somebody else, but are right for me. And I'm really glad to be able to say that I haven't regretted a single decision that I've made since that time. Like moving back home, I feel like was a really good thing for me to do at that time. And starting GIHT when I did has been such a boon for me. It's just been a boon for me. And as I mentioned earlier, I was finally in a place to get a part of my neurodivergence checked out and get a diagnosis so that I can really live my life in a way that I'd always hoped to. And everything I've done in order to become a more authentic version of myself, a more whole version of myself, has improved every part of my life, including relationships with people who are close to me, including with family members, with my friends. This podcast is actually one of the things that I was able to do because I started that journey of going on hormones. And even after starting hormones, it is kind of trials and errors. Honestly, figuring out the dosage and then managing when a form of testosterone that I was on stopped being imported into Korea, so I have to switch to a different type of getting the testosterone and switching between clinics and all this stuff. Everything has happened with some amount of uncertainty, and I just think that that's life. So starting this podcast was in the middle of that uncertainty, and I've been able to gain this perspective through doing this project, through making these decisions that I felt were kind of out of step with a lot of what my peers were doing, or could even really understand my reasons for doing. I did everything because of extremely personal reasons, and I think I've been able to gain that understanding and perspective of how important it is to do things that feel very important to you, even if the process of getting there or even the process of doing those things doesn't pan out exactly as you had hoped or you had envisioned. And I kind of struggle with control issues and perfectionist tendencies, but so much of my life since starting hormones has been a process of letting go of a lot of control and just accepting that life isn't clear-cut. And really all that's in your control is the decisions that you make with the resources that you have. And it's been empowering and humbling in equal amounts. And I feel like now, having gotten diagnosed for my gender dysphoria and ADHD and having booked my top surgery, I feel like I'm at this mini sort of finish line for what I had hoped to do. Around this time last year, I had set myself some goals, and because I gave myself enough space and room to really just kind of focus on those things, I feel like I have been able to meet them all. And I still don't think that setting goals and achieving those goals are the most important things in life, but these were goals that really matter to me, and I'm just really happy and grateful that I've been able to meet them. Now, I think in the next few months, it's going to be a whole new chapter of my life, really thinking about my life as my life and not as something that other people have told me to live or expected me to live. And I'm gonna have to figure so many things out moving forward, but I'm actually really excited. I'm looking forward to it. Wrapping up season 1 of this show is also kind of a mini milestone for me, because this project was something that I started purely really because I wanted to. Not because I really expected any kind of outcome specifically, but just because I knew that I needed a space like this, and I wanted to create a space like this for other people who may be going through a similar time as me, or maybe at different points in their journeys, but could still tune into and feel like there's a space for them to just, relax. And so I'm just really happy about that I've been able to do this. And I feel like being queer and being trans and being third culture also has taught me so much about not looking at life, not looking at people, not looking at myself as something that needs to be a certain way, but as something that I've got to experience as myself and not through somebody else's lens. And the process of discovering how to do that has honestly been like more mind-blowing than I really ever imagined it to be. And yeah, there's probably not many other words I can add to this, but this is kind of the story of how I have moved through life so far and how I have come to sit here to speak to you on the Coffeeshop AU. I started working on the idea for this show sometime in the spring of last year, and the way it started is I was sitting at a cafe with a friend. It was actually EL, whose episode is the one that was released last week. And I wanted to publish that episode before my own because you can really tell how much my voice has changed. That episode was recorded in November of last year, and you can really hear the shift. I kind of liked that contrast. So I was sitting in a cafe with her, and we were talking about, I think, books and some TV shows that we've been consuming, and talking about popular media. Obviously, it kind of led us down this path of like talking about the fandoms and the fanfiction community. For those of you who don't know what fanfiction is, it's fictional stories written by fans of whatever, like TV shows, movies, books, like popular media with characters. Also, there's a genre called like real person fic or real people fic, RPFs, where they take actual actors or like boy bands, musicians, and they will pair these members together. So it's kind of like creating this fictional world for your favorite people / characters to live in, and you can arrange their storyline so that it's closer to the kind of story that you want to see rather than the original narrative, which may be really interesting but like not exactly what you want to see. And the original narrative is called canon narrative. So in this fanfiction world, a lot of stories that happen are queer. There's like a lot of queer writers who are writing queer storylines, even if the canon setting, like orientation of the characters they're writing about might be straight or assumed to be straight. And this is because even though there is more visibility for queer characters and there is more queer representation and more diversity gradually on popular media, as a queer audience, we still don't get as many stories as straight people do. So it's just been like a very well established culture within the fanfiction community to write these queer stories. And I think over time, there came about this categorization of almost like genres for these stories. Like a lot of people will be writing about, for example, their favorite characters going through stuff in a fantasy world, right? No matter what fandom you're in, you could write a story set in a fantasy world. So those kinds of stories, those kinds of world setting would be called the fantasy AU. AU standing for Alternative Universe. And there are a host of different world settings that have become popular over time. And some other examples of this are college AUs, where stories take place in a college and everybody is a student or a faculty member. And there's also a flower shop AU, tattoo shop AU. So it's really fun to see this like taking of certain characters, let's say from a really high fantasy world setting, and like that's the canon setting, but you can take those characters who are like elves and dwarves and then put them in a college AU, and they can just all go to school together and work on assignments and play like beer pong or something. And this kind of crossing over of genres I find really interesting. And EL at the time was actually reading a book, and it was like a fantasy fiction book, but it was set in a coffee shop. It was all about these characters trying to build and open up a coffee shop in this medieval sort of city. The Coffeeshop AU is actually one of the more popular alternative universe settings in the fan fiction world, and we were talking about why it's so popular, and I think we came to the conclusion that just like we're sitting in a coffee shop right now and we can just talk about whatever and we don't don't feel we're judged by each other. We can kind of sip our little coffees or matcha lattes and kind of just like relax. And coffee shops really just do have that feeling attached to them. It's usually open to everybody, and you go into coffee shops to chill and hang out with people you like, hopefully. And or you can just do whatever you want. Nobody's gonna care that you're reading a book or just working on your laptop or listening to music or zoning out. Like, it is one of those rare spaces where everyone is kind of welcomed and everyone can just spend their time however they want to. And there's not a lot of pressure to be a certain way. And the reason that the Coffeeshop AU appeals so much to people in the fandom or people in the fanfiction community, in this case, is because if we're talking about queer people who are writing queer stories, there's just not a lot of places in the world where you can just be yourself and be welcomed as somebody with a queer identity or orientation. But once you set the story in the Coffeeshop AU, there's an automatic sort of baseline of coziness to it, almost. It's kind of a very low stakes setting in a world where everything is high stakes. In the real world, and also in a lot of different AUs, because they feature more real life-like situations. Unless we're talking about the fantasy AU, that can be totally different. But in a lot of these other everyday modern AUs, like college AUs or tattoo shop AUs, flower shop AUs, whatever, I think there is that element of the potential for queerphobia lurking. Like, telling a story in a realistic way, I think, unfortunately requires writers who are writing about queer stories to have some of that pain present in the story, because that's how real life works for most of us. But in the Coffeeshop AU, if you read stories that are set in the Coffeeshop AU, like, there can be a little bit of that, but in the stories that I've read personally, you leave some of that behind. And you're just invited into this space where your only mission is to be nourished by the drinks that are prepared for you. And in a lot of these stories, sometimes the character is working as a barista and they meet some other characters who like come in as customers. A group of characters might go to the same coffee shop and kind of make friends, meet each other. And that, to me, feels like a safe space I can see myself being in with my friends. So Yael and I got to just talking about how necessary it is for queer people like us, people at different intersections of identities and also abilities, like neurodivergent people, how important it is for us who feel very different and often kind of unwelcome by society to have that kind of even a fictional space to go to and feel safe for a little bit. And so we're like, wow, spaces like that can be very rare, and it's great that a lot of people are writing stories within that category. How great is this? And then we were like, just being able to have this conversation with each other, sitting in this coffee shop that we were sitting in at the time, just being able to like connect like this and not having to mask, not having to act in a certain way in order to be accepted by each other. This is also a safe space. And I was like, yeah, that is so true. Like, every time I have conversations with other friends, that feels like I can relax and be myself and really share things that I want to share with them. And then afterwards, I feel very recharged and replenished, just like that experience of like sitting in a coffee shop and spending time however you want to can also recharge you. And so I was like, if our conversations can actually be safe spaces for people who connect to what we're talking about, then what if we actually recorded our conversations and we shared it with people who are interested in hearing it? That could be another kind of safe space. And Yael was like, yeah. And that was how this whole project came about. It was slow progress. There was a lot of trials and errors, and I still think that we're at the very beginning of whatever journey this is going to be for us. But that's why I named the title of this show the Coffeeshop AU, in the hopes that whoever listens in, whether for 1 episode or 10 episodes or more, they can feel like we are in a safe space together. And that at least while you're listening to the show and or sharing your story on the show, you don't really need to pretend or like mask yourself for the fear of being judged or rejected or criticized, and rather you'll feel welcomed and celebrated and nourished by the stories that we get to share together. In preparation for this episode, I asked listeners and my friends who have been guests on the show to send in some questions for me to answer because I knew that I would be awkward sitting here and talking basically just to myself into the mic. And I got quite a few questions, so let me go through this in the best way that I can. So there is a question by a listener whose name is Cheha. Thank you, Cheha, for writing in. And I think she's from Seoul, Korea. Her question is, have you experienced any changes to your personal life since beginning the Coffeeshop AU? If so, please do tell. And if you are planning a second season, I am curious to know what direction it'll go in. And my answer to that is yes. I have definitely seen changes in my personal life since starting this project. The first thing that I've noticed is I'm not super great at listening. I mean, I'm not bad at listening, but I don't think I'm as good as I thought I was at listening to other people because I'll have this conversation with a friend, I'll record it and then I'll edit it. But while I'm editing it, I'll keep hearing new stuff that they're saying, little details that I kind of missed while we're actually talking. So that's one thing I've noticed, and it's a good reminder for me to listen better, and if I feel like I've missed a detail during the conversation, just to ask questions to clarify, because apparently my brain will just zone out at the weirdest times sometimes, and I don't know how much of this is GHT and if it's going to shift back to something else or if I've just always been that way. I am on ADHD meds now, so I'll see if that makes a difference. Also, working on this project has really helped me deepen my friendships and deepen my relationships in a way that I wasn't really expecting, and I don't think my friends are expecting either. Some of the guests that I've had on the show I've known for years and years, and we think we know each other really well, or at least I think I know them pretty well, and then for the first time ever, really, they're sharing the trajectory of their life in a very linear way in one sitting, and to me, just to hear them talk about the stuff and not just describe events, but those events meant to them and what they were left with because of the things that happened to them, that was kind of new information, and that actually helped me understand better how they've become the person they are now. And so I think just hearing my friends tell their stories in more depth and letting them tell their stories without interrupting so much, because usually in everyday life conversations, they'll tell their story, I'll tell my story, and we'll go back and forth. But for the podcast, I just kind of had to stop talking and just listen. And for the most part, I think I did okay in listening. And so I really just got to hear their story in a more whole way, almost, not so much in bits and pieces. And that has helped me appreciate so many new things in my friends. And also, having that conversation with the people that I did, I think actually built even more trust between us. And now whenever we speak personally, I feel there's just that extra level of trust and that space to be vulnerable with each other. I'm not somebody who feels super comfortable being vulnerable around others, but with the people that I've had on the show, especially people that I see quite often, there's just more of an emotional vulnerability between us now, I think. So that's awesome. It's just helped better the quality of my personal relationships. The answer to the second part of Cheha's question, if you are planning a second season, I'm curious to know what direction it'll go in. So the second season of the Coffeeshop AU that I'm planning right now, so in the first season, I've done one-on-one interviews with different people in my life. In the second season, I am planning to invite them back. But now, rather than the episodes being a one-on-one interview, I would like to invite the different guests that I've interviewed together to talk about different topics, different issues, and different popular media that we're all interested in. So, for example, Leia and I are really into several of the same Netflix shows. So some reality TV shows, but also very queer fictional shows, drama shows. She'll always let me know that there's a new season out of such and such show, and I'll be well, I need to watch it then. So we'll be watching it at the same time, and we'll be giving back and forth feedback and thoughts. And then Hyeyoung and I, recently we've been watching a lot of the same movies together. And then the things that I talk about with RV are quite different. There are so many different kinds of conversations that I have with my friends, and I would really like to put those topics together and have different people come on the show together and see how we all interact with each other, because I love every single person I've ever had on the show so much. And I feel like we each bring such different and rich and individual perspective because we have such a different history and individual journeys. So I would really love to bring these people from different groups together and see what kind of conversation we can have together. I'm really excited to introduce them to each other and to see the value that they get from sharing their perspectives with one another. The next question is from Amber's, and it also has to do with making the podcast. The question is, what is the best part of making this podcast? I will have to say what I just mentioned, like being able to deepen my relationships with my friends. And also, I would say, because some of my friends are overseas, they're not all in Korea. And even if we're in the same country, we don't always get to see each other regularly. So I love the fact that the podcast lets us stay in touch and that I can continue to have in-depth conversations with them. Like, everyone I've interviewed in season 1, including you, Ambers, is someone that I truly, truly value and respect, and I hope to invite them back as guests in season 2. So I feel like, yeah, even with Ambers, I do feel like there's more trust now. The next question is from RV, and she has sent in a voice memo, so I'll just play it here.
Hola, just sending in my questions here. Okay, so first question, who were some of your queer awakenings? I'm really curious to know. And then my next question is actually one that you always ask your guests, and I want to know for you right now in this moment, what is bringing you joy? And what are some things that you're looking forward to in the future? Alrighty, so those are all of my questions. I just want to say just how proud I am of you, and I'm just so happy to be a part of this podcast. You're doing such an incredible job, and I hope you feel very proud of yourself. Okay, I love you. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
I love you too. RV has seriously been there for me, probably since the very beginning of my GHT process, and she's seen me like plan this project and put it together, and she has been such an amazing friend throughout. Like, she really knows the ins and outs of a lot of the things that have happened for me to get here, so it means a lot for me, and I love you too. So let me answer your question. So the first question, who are some of your queer awakenings? So I really thought about this question, and I think probably every crush I've ever had was like a queer crush because I'm queer. But if we're talking about really queer awakenings, like this sense of like a bell going off, kind of a sign that I was never straight and I was never cis. This guy comes to mind. This guy I met in church, of all places. My first like big proper crush, and also my first heartbreak. Like, I was going back and forth during summer breaks. I was still studying in England, but I was coming back to Korea to see my family and friends over the summer holidays, and I met this guy at church, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is happening? Like, I love you. I didn't say that, but I did eventually tell him that I really liked him, and he had a very lukewarm reaction. It like really broke my heart because I really loved him. And he was like really open-minded when it came to gender roles and just like about everything. I remember like talking to him about movies and whatnot, and he seemed just like so open and unprejudiced to so many different cultures, even though that church environment we're both in was kind of conservative. I love the fact that he was like so open-minded and didn't seem to have any weird prejudgments about the world and people. And if I think back to what attracted me to him at the time, it was all very kind of like queer things. I'm not saying he's queer. As far as I know, he's probably straight. But like his mannerisms, the way he spoke, the way he dressed, and just the way he moved through the world was extremely unconventional in terms of like what you expect from a guy. I was really attracted to the way that he didn't really seem to care about the standards for how a guy should act or think or speak. And yeah, I definitely think there was some androgynous qualities about him that drew me to him. And obviously it was more than that too, because there were other androgynous people around me that I didn't fall head over heels for. But yeah, my crush on him was like so queer. Even though I was presenting as a girl at the time, as a feminine person, and he was is still ostensibly a cis dude. Like, the feeling that I had when I had this, like, all-consuming crush on him is so similar to the feeling that I had when many years later I would have my first, like, really, really super deep crush on a AFAB, gender non-conforming person. So I think, in my mind, those two are connected, and that was the first signal of my being queer, in a sense, and just kind of connecting with people in the world in a way that was not really traditionally heteronormative. I hope that's an answer. And also, of course, Shane from the L Word. As for what is bringing me joy, aside from, like, working on the show, I would say the weather right now in Korea is amazing. Spring is finally here, and it is probably my favorite season in Korea. I also like summers, specifically summer evenings, because it starts to cool down somewhat. It can get really, really hot in summer in Korea, so, like, right before summer arrives, springtime is just my absolute favorite. And I was born in March, so I think, like, it just feels right to me as well. Like, this is the first season I really experienced once I came into this world, and these days I really like taking photos and videos, so I find myself just going out to places to take pictures, also, like, hang out with people. It's so much easier to move around when the weather is mild and nice and sunny. And also, like, just everybody I pass on the street, they're in a better mood too. Everyone's a little happier, I feel. So the weather is making me super happy. And then, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to in the future? I would say right now, I am looking forward to having my top surgery in May and then recovering without complications, please. And I'm also planning to take about a month's break from the show, and, like, I just want to take a little bit of time off from the projects that I'm working on to plan my next steps and also just, like, relax, because some friends are visiting from overseas and some other friends and I are making plans to go camping while the weather is still nice, so I'm kind of looking forward to that. Just taking a little break. The next question is from from Danny. She sent in a bunch of questions. Let me see if I can answer them all, but might not be able to. So her first question is, of course, I gotta ask what it's like being old. This is great. This is amazing. This is such a Danny thing to ask. And if you don't know why this is a Danny thing to ask, please go and listen to Danny's episode. We have a whole thing about age and aging. Her being my favorite young person and I'm her favorite old person, or whatever. It's a thing between us. So, Danny, I gotta tell you, apart from my back and joints hurting, honestly, it's pretty great. I think the best thing about aging is, at least for me, that I have a much better understanding of myself, both in relation to the world I live in and also just, like, in myself, in terms of who I am at the core, much better than when I was young. And also I get to make, like, actual decisions about my life, which is awesome. And, like, because I was born in the 90s, right? Now I have the resources available to me, like the internet, social media, medical services, and, like, international connections with queer people from different cultures that I did not have before and couldn't have had when I was younger. So that's another great thing about aging, is that you get to see the world you live in change and in some ways evolve and in some ways just kind of get messier. But I like that. I like that I'm able to witness the world changing and actually experience the impact that it has on my life and the lives of other people around me. Yeah, aging is great. Like, ask me again in 10 years, I might have a different answer, I don't know, but I'm just really happy. Like, I honestly never thought I would make it to 30 when I was, like, 18. Content warning, like, self-harm and mention of suicide attempt. Like, I tried to take my own life a couple of times when I was in my late teens because things were so bad. Everything felt really hopeless. And yeah, I just didn't want to be around. So for me to have reached my 30s and beyond that, sometimes I'll just look in the mirror and I'm like, whoa, Jay, like, you made it. How did you make it? I'm so proud of you. I'm still surprised that I'm here sometimes. I feel like every day feels kind of like a bonus almost. And that's maybe like, I don't know if that comes across as like a weirdly like pessimistic or like is that a weird way to look at things? I don't know. But it really does feel like that. Especially going on GAHT and top surgery, that's also things that I just couldn't imagine would become a possibility for me, like a reality for me. And now it is. So I'm just really glad that I get to experience all of this and I get to continue to meet new people and have new experiences, because my assumption at a certain point in my life was that as we get older, we'll just stop having new experiences. And what I'm finding out right now is that that's just not the case. I keep having new experiences, I keep meeting new people, forming new connections, and deepening those connections is just like a new experience in itself. And I know that there are going to be so many other things for me to discover. So yeah, I think that's another thing that's been great about aging. Like there are so many surprises down the road. So I would say overall, it's been awesome and surprising. So the next question by Danny is, what has been your favorite memory in the last couple of years? Probably the day I picked up my first prescription of the testosterone gel that I got started on for my GAHT. I remember buying the gel at the pharmacy across the street from the hospital that I got the prescription from, and holding the little plastic bag with the gel inside it, and then going to a cafe nearby to just like sit at the window and look at the tree. There was like sunshine, everything was shining, and I remember the tree leaves were such a bright green. It was kind of like almost like a unreal shade of green. And it was like brighter than usual, and everything was brighter. And I think it was probably because, like, I don't know, there was something going on in my brain because I was so happy. But I literally just looked out at this tree. I just sat there feeling probably the happiest I'd ever felt in my life. And that sensation, it's hard to describe how amazing it felt. It felt like I was dreaming, but also I was completely grounded in my body for the first time in my life. And so like I just sat there and I enjoyed the moment. I wrote some thoughts down because I really, really wanted to remember that day, that moment, that hour forever for the rest of my life. And I almost feel like whenever something bad happens or something like hard, I have to like struggle with something, I just want to be able to remember that moment, because yeah, it was just such a completely overwhelming sense of like, I'm finally okay. I'm finally happy. And I'm finally actually really able to connect with my body. So on my way home that day, I dropped by my local flower shop and I bought myself a flower. And I have never bought myself flowers before. And I really wanted to buy flowers that day because I think that was the first time that something that I really wanted to celebrate had happened in my life. So I just remember being like just so happy, and that entire day, yeah, it was unreal and also super real at the same time. And I like put it in a little vase and I was looking at it and I was like, I am so glad that I'm alive. Like that's how I felt on that day. And the amount of relief that I felt on that day, I cannot describe. It's like a whole like ocean of stuff just leaving my body. And I felt the whole world was coming off of my shoulders. So I think that's probably my favorite memory in the last couple of years. And the next question by Danny is, if you could go back in time and talk to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell them? I know exactly what I would say to them. And that is, you were right, and I love you. So the next question is from Leia, and the question is, which song reflects this part of your life? Very good question. Difficult question to answer. I actually thought of two songs. The first song that I thought of was a song called No Big Deal, and then in parentheses, I Love You, by a musician called Dodie, Dodie. And it's just this song that I've been listening to on repeat recently. And while I was listening to that song, I kept thinking, this is kind of how I feel about the world right now. And it's a song about wanting to say I love you, but kind of holding back because you kind of don't want things to change and like kind of don't want to be hurt but you kind of are already thinking it. And obviously this song itself, I think, is more about a particular relationship you have with a person. But especially like the chorus part feels like a song that I would sing to the world right now. Like, this is my love song to the world and how the world feels to me right now. Also, there's a part in the song of showering together and then telling each other it's to save water. I do feel like that's also relevant in a sense when I look at it as like a love song to the world, because we need to conserve natural resources. Yeah, I kind of like this song a lot because there's that sense of feeling something real and then kind of dancing around it. And that's a lot of the times how I feel about just like moving around in the world. Like, I want to come out and say, this is how I feel, this is who I am, and like, this is my truth. And then I feel like some part of the world wants to hear it and some part of the world really doesn't, and I don't know which part I'm gonna meet on any given day. So I always feel like I wear my heart on the sleeve, but also I'm not always necessarily willing to be completely honest with the world. And I think that sense of cautious, hopeful feeling, I think that's really, really on point for me at this point in my life. And the second song I was thinking of was a song by G.O.D, who you will know if you have checked out our Instagram. It's a Korean pop boy band from like early 2000s, and they have sung really, really amazing songs that I have been listening to since I was like 12, 11. And one of their songs is called 길, which in Korean it means road. And I remember listening to that song like after having moved to the UK. I was like 14 or 15, and I would just be lying in my bed listening to this song on my like Walkman. And I would be like, holy crap, this is just so real. Like, this is exactly how I feel. Because that song is all about being on a path and not knowing if that's going to lead to happiness. And you don't know exactly if you're actually doing this for yourself or for somebody else. I think it is just a really relatable song for everybody at so many different stages of our lives. But this song for me, it has never been irrelevant to me in my life. But at this particular phase in my life where I feel like I've sort of passed some milestones and now I'm looking at the world in a very different way and trying to figure out a path to commit to. I feel like I have some answers and some compasses to guide me in the decisions that I make, but still, like, the future is unknown. And so I think this song describes that kind of crossroads and that feeling of never being able to be quite sure, but still being on the journey anyway, really well. I love this song so much. I'll probably post it on Instagram so that people will be able to get a taste of it. The lyrics are in Korean, but I'm sure you can find the translation in English. It's just such a good song. So definitely, yeah, 길. And no big deal. The next question is by a listener who asked to remain anonymous. Do you think queer people should be followed by a therapist that is aware of queer struggles, even if you don't go see them for any obvious queer-related issues? I think it is really helpful if they have a context for the things that you're actually telling them. So I feel like when I was going through therapy a couple of years ago, I specifically asked for a therapist who was familiar with trans people, at least the concept of trans people. And my therapist that I got was pretty familiar, but I don't think she was like knowledgeable in the sorts of things that trans people tend to really struggle with in terms of like their daily lives, interactions with people, struggles at work, all this stuff. I enjoyed my experience with her. She helped me a lot, but I still felt like it would have been even better of an experience if she had more of an understanding of just like general things about trans people's realities, or if she had more trans patients and were more familiar with their realities. Because we spend so much of our lives as queer people having to explain our existence, I think it can be really exhausting to go to therapy and also be expected to do that again. So I think, like, even if your therapist doesn't have a ton of experience with queer people, I think they can always do research and learn. And I'm not saying that you can't go to a therapist who is not familiar with queer people and not have good experiences, because I know tons of people who are with their therapist and their therapist doesn't get like a very specific part of their friends' identities. And it could have something to do with their ethnicity. It could have to do with their gender. It could more some other specific part of who they are, but you can still have like a good connection and a good thing happening. But I still definitely think that queer people shouldn't be the ones to always like educate everybody, including their therapists. So I don't think queer people should see therapists who have an understanding in queer matters. But I think in general, healthcare professionals could do more research and learn more about minority identities. Why am I giving advice to like therapists? I also know that a lot of my friends who are in the queer community struggle financially to go to like one-on-one therapies, and I found that whenever there's like a group therapy session available, like offered by different organizations in Korea, for example, my gender clinic that I go to for my hormone therapy, they have started to offer regular meetups with a mental health care professional so that people who are going through gender affirming care can come together and discuss their struggles and experiences together with other people who really get it. And it's at a fraction of the cost that it would take for somebody to go to see a therapist on their own. So I also really want to encourage like people to, if you feel like you need that support and you're not really like in a position to find a one-on-one therapist, or if you want to try something different than the traditional like one-on-one talk therapy, then I would really recommend looking into group therapy as well. My experiences with group therapy has been like really awesome. It was a totally different dynamic, and I felt really seen by all these people who I didn't need to explain anything to. They just understood. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but if you need therapy, there's always ways to make things work. And the next question is from Hyeyoung. She also sent in a couple of questions. Her first question is, what do you think you'll be doing when you're 60? So, I can't really see myself at 60 yet, but if I'm still around then, and the world hasn't completely fallen apart, I would ideally like to be still working on creative projects like this one with people that I really enjoy being around. So I feel like potentially, I could still be making this show, or at least some version of it. I think that could happen. And also, I think it would be really great by then to have some like skill sets and life experiences under my belt so that potentially like I could help other people, especially queer people, especially younger queer people, to help them find their voice in some way or their path in life if they're looking for it. I could just be like somebody they could talk to, and I could just like share my experiences and could sort of in that way help people who may be feeling as lost as I felt when I was younger. I think that'd be really cool. I just think that like in general, a lot of young people need guidance and mentorship from healthy adults who can see things from their point of view. And like growing up as a trans teen and a young person, I had very, very few adults that I could relate to and then could actually relate back to me. And I know that I really struggled with that. And so if I can be an adult like that to a young person, that would be awesome. I would also really like to learn how to surf and also go diving. I really like the ocean. I like being around water. I think it would be awesome at 60 to like be able to surf in my free time and go diving. And I don't know, like take the trash out of the water or something. I think it would be really nice to keep fit enough to lead an active life. Who knows? I could have like a six-pack in my 60s. I do not currently, but I could in my 60s. And yeah, I could be like the hot, non-binary, cool, advice-giving hippie person that you could surf around with and also has a six-pack. And maybe some tattoos. Maybe. I'll think about it. I have a skin condition, so I don't know if that's the best idea, but next. Next question by Hyeyoung is, what is your favorite movie and why? So I don't have a favorite movie because I love so many movies in so many different ways, but there is a movie called Truly, Madly, Deeply by the late Anthony Minghella, who also directed the talented Mr. Ripley, Cold Mountain, The English Patient, and I would say Truly Madly Deeply, that movie, it comes pretty close to being, like, it is one of my favorite movies. I think he's probably my favorite director, and Truly Madly Deeply was made in the 90s, I believe, and it has that slightly low budget, small scale, slightly unpolished feel of someone just making something because they love it and everybody else involved in it also really love it. And it's a story about a woman whose partner has passed and she's in the grieving process. And even though it's a movie about grief, there is so much compassion and love and acceptance for people, for different kinds of people, and this kind of willingness to see the humanity in all the different characters that we meet. And they're so imperfect in their own ways. And I feel like that's actually a through line in a lot of Anthony Minghella's movies. And in this movie, there are also really lovely, like, whimsical, fun, light moments that are just, I think, they're hard to find in a bigger budget movie. He's done some really amazing work since then. I believe this was his first feature film. And, like, this movie, for me at least, is like the heart of every other movie that I've seen by him since then. It just has that very pure, very simple, but also extremely nuanced understanding of emotions and, yeah, just empathy for human beings. I just love it so much. Oh, it also stars Alan Rickman. Hyeyoung loves Alan Rickman, so I think you would enjoy this movie, maybe. He plays a ghost in this movie. Oh, yes, I think you would actually like him because you like the dark and kind of gloomy feel of some of his characters that he's played. This movie was also set in London, and I was living in London when I first watched this movie. So all the places that the protagonist goes to, it felt very local to me and, like, super accessible. It felt like I was watching a story unfolding next door. I had been to the places that are in the movie, and I think it felt very comforting to me to see this kind of story happen in a city that I was living in, which could a lot of the times feel like really big and kind of cold to me. So yeah, I really love this movie. The next question is from a listener, and they're calling themselves ? They actually also sent in an email, and I want to read that before I read their question because it means a lot to me when people write in. And I don't know, like, people have been really hesitant to, like, send their stories in for some reason. It could just be that we're just not there yet because we're a pretty new show, but I just want to read it to you because, yeah, it means so much to me. Hi, Jay. I wanted to write to you that I love your podcast. I like that you ask people about their favorite drinks at the beginning of the episodes. I am writing to you over a non-fat vanilla yogurt that I wish was full fat. Yum. I hope you can get the full fat next time. I would call myself ? As I stopped defining myself and now I know that I can date people who have beautiful souls regardless of gender. I am a loyal listener of 비혼세 that I got to know through 영혼의 노숙자. So 2 Korean podcasts, one of which is hosted by a friend, and the other one, like, all my friends listen to it. They're both really great shows, and I guess ? is a listener of both shows. Because there are some overlap between the 2 shows. I am a loyal listener of 비혼세 that I got to know through 영혼의 노숙자, and someone who supports all kinds of human beings. Hyeyoung mentioned your podcast in one episode of 비혼세, I think, that Sheri recorded a couple of episodes with you, and I came across the Coffeeshop AU Instagram account while I was lurking around for Danbi and Yeoreum's photo. By the way, for those who don't know, Danbi and Yeoreum have an Instagram account now at Somewhere in Danbi, I think. And so I tag them in some of the posts that I've made, I think, on the Coffeeshop AU IG, and maybe that's how ? got to the account. Okay. Now that I write about it, it sounds so creepy. 3 exclamation marks. It does not sound creepy at all. If this is creepy, I am welcoming the creep factor now. Like, I just want people to look at my beautiful, amazing friends and their animal families. So, you're very welcome. It was a lovely surprise that someone in Korea started a queer podcast talking about diversity. Finally, yay! I was born and raised in Korea. I had crushes on girls in my early teenage years and realized that I had feelings for the same gender. That made me explore myself into a queer community back then and hang out with people who had similar interests online and offline until I got outed at school by someone that I knew from the community, in parentheses, it was painful. Oh my gosh, that is painful. Since then, I pretended like I was a cisgender and heterosexual for survival, but deep inside I knew that I was queer, as my teenage years were all about girls. Also, I relate to you when you talk about your experiences in the UK, as I experienced something similar in Europe. I can write so much more about it and will save it for later. I have been recovering from a bad low back pain since last year, and your podcast is one of my companions that goes along with me wherever I go for a walk. Aw. Thank you for making a podcast that comforts people like me, and I am sure there are tons who can empathize with me. With lots of love, ? Thank you so much, ? This is so nice. Thank you. Seriously. And yeah, I hope your lower back pain gets better, and I'm really sorry that you got outed at school. That really sucks. Why are people mean? Like, people are so mean. And I'm really looking forward to listening to more of your stories. And thank you again, so much for sending in your story. And if there's anyone out there who also wants to send in their stories, please go ahead. You do not have to use your real name. You can share as much as you like or as little as you like. But we really do love hearing from you. Recently, I ran into somebody at a party who I'd met once or twice before, and I had mentioned to them that I was doing this podcast. And after the party, we were messaging back and forth in DMs. And she was like, I forgot to tell you at the party because I was so out of it, but I'm really loving listening to your podcast. And I was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. That means so much to me. And just it's really awesome to listen to stories of other people who are having the same kind of doubts. And yeah, so I know that there are people listening who are not writing in, and I'm sure you have your reasons, but just know that if you do, it just gives me and my guests and I think other listeners just that feeling of, we're doing something together. The stories that I'm telling with my friends are reaching people. I can see the downloads numbers and everything, which is awesome, but it's an amazing experience to hear from somebody who is listening and who have stories to share, because that's the kind of the core goal of the show, is to share more stories with more people and have people feel safe enough to send in their stories. So thank you so much, ? I will now read your question, which is, what's your favorite spring drink? I want to give changes as it gets warmer. My favorite spring drink is probably cherry blossom tea by a company called Osalok. It's a Korean tea company, and I love all their tea bags. They smell so amazing. The smells will hit you. I should say fragrance, right? Because it's a good smell. But once you open up the box, it will just hit your face, full of just these amazing heavenly scents. And cherry blossom tea is, I really love it, even though it makes me kind of gassy afterwards. Cherry blossom tea iced is probably my favorite thing to drink in spring. It's so thematic too. When you drink it, there are all these very subtle taste notes of honey and cherry and just the spring of it all. It's like having spring in your mouth and in your nose, and it's just, yeah, it's like drinking spring itself. So that's my favorite spring drink. I would love to know what spring drink you switched to, ? So let us know. The last question is by Leia again. I moved this question back because it was similar to ? question. So Leia's question is, what is your ultimate comfort food / drink? I think this is such an appropriate couple of questions to wrap up this show with, because I always ask what other people's favorite drinks are. And my ultimate comfort food is probably kimbap, made by my mom. It is nutritious, it has lots of different textures, and it keeps me full for a long time. It's not heavy, it's not too salty, it's not too sweet, but it has a blend of all of the different flavors. And also it's just so familiar to me, because she would always pack kimbap for me on sports days in Korea. So it brings back all the memories of a lot of communal events, and it's my life wrapped up in dried seaweed and some rice. I can eat kimbap every day, honestly. And as for my comfort drink, I would say cold barley tea, boricha, brewed by my grandmother. I had two grandmothers. One passed away and one is still here. And I grew up drinking her cold barley tea that she always had in her fridge, and it's the best thing to drink, especially on summer days when sweltering heat is trying to disassemble your entire being. You just get a glass of the barley tea and it's like nectar, you know? And it also pairs well with any kind of food, especially Korean food. So it's like the perfect pairing. I will have kimbap as my comfort food and then have borischa as my comfort drink. Like, I'm so grateful to all my guests now because it is not an easy thing to recount your life and talk about how you got to the place that you are in as a person. Right now, I didn't share like everything that I had meant to share because I'm sure there's gonna be more opportunities to do that in the future. So like, I don't know if that was kind of a comprehensive view of my journey so far, but you know, like I said, there will be way more episodes to come in which to discuss the like little details in. And yeah, I mean, if you have any questions after listening to this episode, even though I just answered like 20 questions, just let us know. Just email us. Just DM us. We're always waiting. Like, this space is for you. If you do want to send anything in, either written or via recorded voice notes, both are fine. Our Instagram handle is at _coffeeshop_AU. And our email address is hi, at thecoffeeshopau.com. All one word, thecoffeeshopau. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of just my voice, and I am looking forward to hearing from you. Like I mentioned earlier, we are going to be taking a short break before we start the next season. But we will be back soon, and this is like such an amazing experience to make this show with everybody who were kind enough to take part and to share their time and experiences with me and with everybody else who's listening. Yeah, I'm just so grateful that I got this opportunity to make this show and to connect with all the different people in my life, and also with you. Hopefully, I got to connect with you on some level. Even if I never hear from you, I'm still really happy that you are listening and that you are spending time to listen to our stories, that we all put a lot of effort into recording and editing and publishing, because I really do think that this is a way that we can make a difference by sharing our stories and then listening. So thank you so much for listening to season 1 of The Coffee Shop AU, and we'll see you again soon. Bye!